Okay, my friends, Erev Tov. We are live, which just means that we are waiting for Kim's comment saying we're live. Until Kim says okay, we're not okay. Until Kim verifies my existence, my legitimacy in the meantime, David, pass me a calendar. 1 second. In the meantime, everyone is examining this gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous calendar that I am very proud of. Put a lot of work, me and Karina and I. And if you need a Jewish calendar, come by the Chabad Jewish Center on Atlantic Boulevard. We have 2,000 of them. So we got one for you and for your neighbor and for your other neighbor and for your brother and your sister. And, so I'm going to give one to you. We're going to be mailing out some. If you need us to mail you one, you can send me an email. Maybe post on the chat. I don't look at Facebook so much. So send me a WhatsApp message or an email to rabbi@mychabadcenter.org. David, email me or email even the office at mychabadcenter.org, and you will get your very own Jewish calendar. It's a beautiful calendar with beautiful pictures, beautiful, nice. It's beautiful. Okay, anyway, my friends, we're ready to start. Oops, there you go. Perfect. Good evening, Kim. Now I know I'm alive. Just got validated my existence. Good evening, Marsha, all the way from a very distant Atlantic Springs. And we'll dedicate our learning tonight for the Refuah Shleima for the schools of Reuven, David, Reuven, and Masha. Have a gesund, B'ezrat Hashem. And good evening, Stephanie. And good evening, Shira. Shalom to everyone watching. And of course, my buddy Art. Shavua Tov. We are ready to begin. So the learning is for David, Reuven, and Masha, and in memory of the neshama of Yitzchak Tzvi ben Yosef, whose soul shall have an elevation in Gan Eden. So, my friends, we are going to talk tonight. And good evening, Miyakel, watching all the way from Yukon, Canada. I love it. It's a little far away. It's far away. Maybe we're going to come visit you one day. It's definitely on my bucket list. That part of the world. I would love to see that part of the world. No, go like to Whistler and to Vancouver, and then we have Koreans joining us from Detroit. That's not on my bucket list, no offense. But okay. Good evening, Korean. I hope you and Lester are good. Okay, my friends, we're going to start. If you remember last week, we were talking about the very first writing of a book of Jewish law, which was the Mishnah. And I'm not going to repeat what we discussed last week, but just it's very important to know where we're holding. I'm just trying to get into this groove, so to say, giving a big picture of Jewish history, but from a human perspective. But it's very important to remember that according to Jewish tradition, we did not write down the laws of the Torah. We had the written Bible, the written text, and God wanted a system of teachers with oral transmission where you couldn't just go and read the book, read the self-help manual. Not that anyone ever reads manuals anyway, but you would have to have a teacher and have that interaction and that direct guidance. Again, it's not really the point of tonight's discussion to discuss the why or how it is, but just understand that was unique. And then they came along. Good evening, Gerald is watching us, and good evening, Steph. Yes, and Alice is joining us from North in Maryland. Lifsha? I don't know where Lifsha is. Is that in Maryland, Lifsha? So good evening, everyone. So we have this transformative moment where this great man, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who is so great, he's not even called by his name. He's just described as Rebbe. You say Rebbe? Rebbe. That's the one that saved Judaism by writing down the Mishnah. And that would literally change the face of the way Judaism operated, much like our Rebbe changed the way the way Jewish organizations and Jewish rabbis and Jewish agencies interact and engage the community and understand the importance of joy and celebration. And Tonight's had a class on the Rebbe and how he changed, for the better, obviously, Jewish culture. So now we continue with that. Oh, one second. Yeah, perfect. How are you, Hadassah? Good evening. I'm glad you're here. Okay. So now, my friend, good evening, Maria, who's watching online. Good evening, Hadassah, just walked in. So now, my friends, we're going to continue this conversation, and we're going to move on to the next major transition that takes place, which is after Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi finished writing the Mishnah, which, if you remember, was a brief period in time. We had some respite from the Roman government. Antonius was a friend of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, as discussed last week. They were switched actually as babies by his birth and all that. And we have the Jews still living in Israel. However, the story of the Jews in Israel becomes difficult once again. Unfortunately, the Romans again start giving the Jews a hard time, and more Jews have left Israel, gone all over the world, but many have gone to join the very strong Jewish community in Babylonia. Now, there's been a strong community in Babylonia from before the destruction, from even before the destruction of the first temple. And throughout the entire second temple, there were Jews living in Bavel, in Babylonia, who were more or less financially a strong community. They were physically, they were safe. They didn't face the same persecution of the Jews living in Israel faced. But then after the destruction of the temple, and after all the stories of, we went through Masada, Bar Kokhba and all that, at Beitar, eventually this community in Israel becomes very, very strong. Now, before I go into the history of some of the rabbis who helped write or compile the Talmud, I want to explain something. When Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi wrote the Mishnah, it had to be written in a way that would be easy to memorize. I did mention this last week, but I want to develop this idea a little bit more. Because remember, there was no printing presses back then. There was no, emails or online printing where you can just write a lot and write flowery. You had to write a book that would be easily memorized, which requires a certain grammatical, syntax, and has to be very concise. Because the longer it is, the harder it is to memorize, the harder it is to commit to memory. And so by design, the Mishnah had to compact as much information as possible into as few words as possible. Is Babylonia Baghdad? I don't know if it's Baghdad. It is Iraq, that area, yes. And so the Jewish people have this very, very unique challenge where they have to find a way to, somehow bring their Judaism into, they create this language, so to say, where they can continue studying the Mishnah, but it's very concise. And as the years go by and the generations go by, remembering and understanding the implication of all the cases and all the laws and all the words written in the Mishnah become more and more challenging for people to understand. And in addition to being something memorized, Rabbi also didn't want that the Mishnah should replace the need for a teacher. Remember, Judaism very strongly says we need to have this engagement, this interaction between teacher and student. This is a very important aspect of the whole structure of Judaism. Judaism is not just about information and knowledge. Information is about a way of living, about a way of being, and that comes not just from reading a book of knowledge, of texts, but from role models, from people that care about you and guide you, etc. And so we have, what I want to do tonight is I want to tell you the story of the Talmud, the two Talmuds that were written, but I do not want to do it in a historical context because it's not really a historical class. This is a class on people and how we can find life lessons from people. So I want to share with you some of the stories of the main rabbis involved in the writings of these two different books in Israel and in Babylonia. And obviously we'll understand the Talmud also a little bit, but I want to give you some stories that I think will be very, very interesting and to help you understand the people who were teaching these explanations and elucidations of the Mishnah, which would eventually be compiled into what we would call today the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, but I want to make sure this point is clear. What we're really talking about today is not books. I'm not giving you a class on two different kinds of books, and there are actually a lot of books. Tonight what we're really talking about is the people that were able to teach, to learn, to study the Mishnah, to teach it, and to be the ones who would give the Jewish people the ability that in exile, without a temple, without the central authority, without that which had allowed Judaism to survive for the first 2,000 years of its history, to be able to turn exile into a traveling academy and to turn a page of the Talmud into a home into which a Jew could find a connection to our history and to know how to live as a Jew. Okay, so let us start with the rabbis living in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, okay? After Rabbi passes away, we have his teachers, Rav and Shmuel, and then Rabbi Yechanan and Rabbi Chia. These are some of the main generation, the main leaders. There's a few hundred years, just so you know, from the Mishnah till the Talmud in Jerusalem. I think it's like 300 years, if I'm not mistaken. So you have some of the main rabbis, Rav, Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chia, and the main rabbi who I'm going to focus a little on is Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan was a rabbi living in Israel. He is the one who is very, very most quoted in, I'm not going to say most, I'm not giving a statement of statistics, but very often quoted in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. He was the primary rabbi and leader of the Jewish community living in Israel. And as I already said, he is not just a teacher, he's not just giving information, he's the guide and the leader of the community. I want to tell you a story about him and his brother-in-law. Rabbi Yochanan was a great rabbi from an illustrious family. And one day he's traveling on the river and he sees a bandit. This bandit, a thief, he was a highway robber. Yeah, you ever heard of highway robbers? Today we don't have them. Today they're just they do what's it called? Today they're sitting in their underwear in their in Pakistan or wherever, in India, right? In Nigeria, there you go, Nigeria, doing online scams. So today you don't really have highway robbers, sitting by the deserted exits on the highway, trying to stop people. But back then, before you had online scams, so they were highway robbers. You were traveling, you were very vulnerable, you were alone, and they would attack you. And he was one of the most ferocious leaders, one of these highway bands. His name was Reish Lakish. His power was so great, he could swim across this river in like 7 strokes of his arm. He was very, 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 very powerful. And he comes, and it's a fascinating story about these two men. And one day when Rabbi Yochanan was by the Jordan River, he sees this man, Reish Lakish, who saw the rabbi and jumped into the river to go attack him. And Rabbi Yochanan saw the strength of this man, so he says to him, what a waste. You have so much power, you have so much strength. Your strength belongs for the Torah. Why are you wasting all? Look at how much power you have. You can swim across the river so quickly. You're such a mighty, powerful giant with so much energy, so much strength, so much, adrenaline, koyach, more than just koyach, like adrenaline. It's like swimming. If you would take that adrenaline, that testosterone, I don't know, like that energy you have, and insert it into Torah instead, you can imagine what a Torah giant you'd be. It would be amazing. So how does Reish Lakish answer? He says Rabbi Yochanan was a very beautiful looking person. He says to him, and your beauty is being wasted in the Torah. Your beauty belongs in a room of women. You can use your imagination. So you're telling me I'm wasting my energy being a robber instead of using my energy for Torah. You're wasting your beauty in the yeshiva. Your beauty should be be used for prostitution. Should be used for women. So how does Rabbi Yochanan respond? These stories are more interesting than giving you the dry text. So how does Rabbi Yochanan respond? Rabbi Yochanan responds, and he says, my sister is even more beautiful than me. You think I'm good looking? My sister, she's a woman. She's even more beautiful than I am. If you commit yourself to learning Torah, I will give you my sister in marriage. Yeah, wow is right. There's a lot of wows to this story. The story's not over just yet. But can you imagine today? I have a shidduch for you. Who's a shidduch? Oh, he's a highway robber, but he's very strong. Well, you'll like him. What's amazing here is how Rabbi Yochanan was able to see the potential in Rabbi Yochanan. Physical strength is not just physical strength. I mean, there's a whole farbring in here, really. Physical strength is an expression of certain energy that your soul has that can be very, very powerful. And so he was saying, I believe in you so strongly. I'm so convinced that you could become so great if you would dedicate yourself properly to the study of Torah, that I'm willing to commit that my sister would marry you if you make that commitment. He really believes what he's saying. It's not just, you should study Torah. Any rabbi could say that, right? He's putting his money where his mouth is. And, okay. Reish Lakish decides, got a deal. And he makes the commitment to go study Torah and to marry the sister of Rabbi Yochanan. And when he does that, he wants to go swim back across the river to go retrieve his belongings. And Talmud says he can no longer swim back across the river. The moment he gave his energy to Torah, he already lost the physical energy. He already transitioned. Meaning, there's also a whole farbring here. How much your mind impacts what your strength is for. If you convince yourself that working out is the most important thing, then yeah, you'll have energy for working out. If you convince yourself that learning Torah is the most important thing, then the energy you'll have will automatically be channeled in a different direction to be for a different purpose. Okay, anyway. So, Reish Lakish leaves behind the business of being a robber, goes to study with his future brother-in-law, Rabbi Yochanan, to study the Torah. And indeed, and this is really why I'm telling you the story. Indeed, Reish Lakish becomes a great, tremendous Torah scholar, together with the training and the teaching of his brother-in-law, Rabbi Yochanan, one of the great sages of Eretz Yisrael, of Israel, and he does indeed marry Rabbi Yochanan's sister. And they become best friends. And chavrusas. You know what a chavrusa is? Very good, very good. A chavrusa literally means a friend, but it's a study partner. So if you ever went to a yeshiva, you just went in for a visit for a few minutes, you'll see that a yeshiva is not a very quiet library setting. If you ever been to yeshiva, you know, and Saul was in yeshiva, right? And Yosef was spending time in yeshiva. And you go into yeshiva, it's a noisy, sounds like you're in a chicken market. That's what it sounds like. Right, Yosef? Yeah, it sounds like you're in a chicken market. You don't think that you're in a peaceful study of greater knowledge of intellectual people and deep, meditation. They're screaming and they're shouting and they're arguing. It's an intense situation going on. Why? Because they're all full of energy. They're all trying to prove their point and understand the deeper idea. This is called a study partner, a chavrusa. And again, Torah is not just about information or knowledge. Torah is about acquiring a path and a method of how to learn, of how to remember. And I'll talk about this soon. This is the whole idea of Torah, how to acquire a mindset, a way of thinking. And so these two brother-in-laws became dear friends and study partners. The student, Reish Lakish, that had been a robber, now became the study partner of Rabbi Yochanan. Until you want to hear the end of their life, it's not going to be such a happy story. I have to warn you now. Not every story has a happy ending. Yeah. One day learning together. And they were discussing the manufacturer of metal weapons. Meaning, when you make a metal weapon, it becomes tummy. It could become ritually impure. But let's say you make a sword. And the sword comes in contact with a dead body. The sword is now ritually impure. So we're discussing at what point do we say the sword is no longer metal, which is not a vessel, doesn't receive impurity, and becomes a vessel that does become impure. And so the point is not really the argument. So Rabbi Yochanan gave his thing, and he said that it's when you put the object in the furnace. When you put it in the furnace to melt it, that's what makes it a vessel. And Reish Lakish said, no, it's not a vessel yet. Until you polish it in the water after, you take it out of the oven, but it still has to be cleaned before you would use it, so it's not considered a vessel until you clean it. So Rabbi Yochanan then made a personal shtech, so to say, a personal insult against it as a joke, but his brother-in-law took it very personally. And he said, I guess you're right. After all, the bandit knows his craft of his trade. So we're discussing when a person would use a sword. What do I know about swords? I'm a yeshiva man. So I would imagine that once it comes out of the fire, it's ready. You're saying that it's not considered ready until you put it in water. You're the professional bandit over here. I'm going to accept your ruling that, And Reish Lakish was very, very deeply offended by this comment. It was not meant to be offensive, but it hurt because he was reminding him of his past that he had abandoned, of his criminal history. And so Reish Lakish says to Rabbi Yochanan, what benefit did you give me? They called me master. When I was a criminal, I was the head of the gang, right? There they called me master. And here you're calling me a criminal. You're like, so you put me down. You brought me out of that world, telling me I'll become a Torah scholar. Now you're reminding me my past was very, very broken. And he got very hurt and he left. Now Rabbi Yochanan was hurt by Reish Lakish. And they began to fight and stop talking. As a result of that, Reish Lakish became seriously ill. And actually, the wife of Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan's sister, came to Rabbi Yochanan asking her to pray for her brother. And it didn't end too well. And Reish Lakish passed away. When he passed away, Rabbi Yochanan was heartbroken that his brother-in-law and his dear friend, his study partner, had passed. And I guess he probably also felt guilty after he was the one that had caused him to be offended with the comment that he made. And he was very, very inconsolable with grief on the loss of Rabbi Reish Lakish. So the other yeshiva rabbis, the other sages, sent the other great rabbi, his name was Elazar ben Pedas. They sent him, who was a brilliant scholar, to come and study with Rabbi Yochanan to try and distract him and help him get back to himself. And whenever Rabbi Yochanan would offer a teaching, the Gemara says Rabbi Elazar would produce, I think, 40 supporting sources. Great, right? As someone, whatever I say, you can find proofs to what I say. But not only was Rabbi Yochanan not happy with this, Rabbi Yochanan was deeply upset. He was even more inconsolable. And he says to Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas, are you comparable to the son of Lakish? Whenever I said something, Reish Lakish answered 24 objections to what I said. He had 24 arguments against me. And then I answered him with 24 responses to his 24 arguments. And then the matter became expanded and clarified. You are merely bringing me proof that I'm correct. Do I not know that my position is a good position? This is what the Gemara and Baba Metzia says. He was walking around in the yeshiva, in the study hall. Heicha ata bar Lakish, where are you, my friend Reish Lakish? I don't need someone to come and to, we say in modern day language, to lick me and make me feel good about myself and bring me proofs to justify what I think. I missed the study partner, my brother-in-law, who used to challenge me. And I would challenge him back. And he would challenge me 24 arguments he would have against me. Oh, but 24 arguments, that really helps you really bring out the full appreciation of who you are. And to be able to really bring out your greatness, etc. Yeah, did I lose my camera? For you guys who are watching online, do you see my camera? And he missed that. He missed that. And this is a very important message in general about relationships. Just confirm if you're watching my page that you're seeing my camera. So this is a very, very personal, a very important message in relationships. First of all, relationships, I guess no one's saying that. Okay. So in relationships, you see my camera, Kim? Because I'm not seeing it. Okay, perfect. Okay. I mean, in general, this is a very important lesson, but in regards to the way the Talmud was designed, you walk into yeshiva, you hear the arguing, it's a desire to find truth. It's a desire to find truth. And the idea of studying Torah is not just, okay, give me information and let me, no one should argue with me, no one should contradict me, no one should challenge me, but the opposite way around, that the whole point of learning is to find a search for the truth. And that's what a real relationship is. Okay. Now, so this is just one story that gives you an idea of how they were learning back then. They weren't like trying to make everyone feel good. There was a deep, deep desire and a deep journey, a deep mission to find what is the truth. What is the true message? Okay. And eventually, Rabbi Yochanan will help compile or become the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, which would be the rules and the laws explaining more additional rulings to the Mishnah. It's written much more concise, much shorter. I'll get to the contrast soon. Now let's go to another country, to Babylonia. Okay? So the Jews are in Babylonia, which is also becoming a very strong center of Jewish learning. And there we have the main students. You have Rav and Shmuel, you have Rav Huna, you have Rav Yehuda, you have Rav Nachman, you have Rav Kahana, you have Rabbi, Rav Yosef, Abaye, and Rava, and finally Ravina and Rav Ashi. They go in pairs, by the way. Even in Pirkei Avos and Ethics of a Follower, we find pairs. There wasn't like one rabbi in charge. There was a studying, going on between the two. Thank you, Marlene. So there was always like a shared leadership that came from this study and this back and forth between the rabbis. And again, we're talking about a few hundred years of history here, a few hundred years of scholarship, of learning of Torah, especially in Babylonia, where there was not much oppression or challenge to the Jewish community. The community was wealthy, it was established, there was a strong community, and the rabbis had huge yeshivas. There were major mega centers in cities of Pumbedisa, Nahardal, Surya. These were cities, the Babylonian cities, that had huge yeshivas, huge, with thousands and thousands of students, and they were learning under these rabbis, and they were learning. In fact, certain laws, the rabbis of Babylonia were considered more authoritative than the rabbis of Israel because there were many more of them. The yeshivas, unlike in Israel, which were smaller, were big. There was a lot of students. There was a lot of learning going on, and the community became stronger than any question about, for example, a get. The law, the rulings of the Babylonian rabbis was considered more authoritative than the rabbis living in Israel, although there was constantly a flow of communication back and forth. They weren't like totally isolated communities, but they were different leaderships, etc. Now, in the Babylonian Talmud, you find much more of the debates that characterize today when people say, "Oh, the Jews are always arguing, and the Jews are always, rabbis always argue with each other." That's what you primarily see in the Babylonian Talmud. And when they would make the Babylonian Talmud, they had to find a way to bring everything together, that all of the give and take and all of the years of back and forth study that was used to help compile and create the foundations of the Talmud should all be preserved. And therefore, there is a verse that describes the Talmud that says that he made me dwell in dark places. It's a verse in the book of Psalms. He made me dwell in dark places. And the rabbis said this referring to the Babylonian Talmud, that from the dark place, from a place of exile, from a place where we didn't have the same spiritual greatness as Israel, we had to struggle more in the darkness. When you struggle in the darkness, what you find you appreciate much more. So the rabbis living in Israel lived in a spiritually higher level, so they were able to see the light more. They were able to have the rulings more clear. The rabbis in Babylonia, first of all, many more rabbis, with a much greater pool of knowledge and of dialogue and collaboration, but also there was a certain struggle spiritually to find the truth, and therefore what they found there was very, very important, etc. In fact, the Talmud in Bracha says that Torah is only acquired in study together, and it compares it to fire. How does a fire burn wood? One solitary fire, one piece of wood? No, the more fire, the more everything gets burnt, right? So if you want something to burn, you have to have a lot of fire, and then all the wood together creates a big, strong fire. And the Brachas actually warns against studying alone. Gives another example, like iron. How do you sharpen iron? Against iron. You sharpen the iron, sharpens the other iron. So if you push the iron against the iron, it makes the iron sharper. So too, that when you are just learning yourself, you're not getting sharp from that. When you're studying with someone else and there's that give and take and that, the iron is hitting each other, that is what gives clarity in both directions. Okay. And that's why in the Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, you find all the names of all the rabbis that were involved in the transmission. When you study the Talmud, you see Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rab, Bishpede, Rabbi Chad. This rabbi said the name of that rabbi, who said the name of that rabbi, and you find a lot of names being repeated in the Babylonian Talmud. Why? Because this transmission, not just to remember, to preserve memory, because I'm saying that to preserve Reish Lakish, it says Reish Lakish would review 40 times. Before he would go study with his brother-in-law Rabbi Yochanan, he would study something 40 times in order to remember what he was going to learn. 40 times. We can't even imagine that. Today, study something 40 times, kill me first, right? Today, kids can barely study something 2 times. One time, but four times is like, you feel like this is the stupidest thing. Why am I reading the same thing over and over? But back then, where they didn't have the distractions we have, but they also didn't have the printed books that we have. So in order to commit something to memory, they would review it and review it and review it 40 times. In fact, the Talmud says the difference between someone who serves God and someone who just has the title a servant of God, but is not considered an active serving of God, is the difference between someone who studies only 100 times versus someone who studies 101 times. Meaning, it was considered normal to study something 100 times. They didn't have books. They didn't have a recording to go back and watch later or to get like cliff notes. Today, you don't even need to listen to the class. You ask AI to summarize it for you afterwards. You get like a little summary, cliff notes, and you can pretend like you watched it when you didn't watch it. Back then, the only way to know something long term was to review it 40 times, 100 times. So you had to preserve that tradition. But in addition to that, it also wanted to give us different opinions, because the different opinions are a part of the search for the truth. Different opinions are a part of how Judaism and the way we do Jewish law is not just about what we do. I mean, obviously it's about what we do, but it's appreciating that there was a human effort to work and toil, to put an effort to discover the Word of God, to work to understand what God wants from us. That's a very important component of studying Torah, even till today. When we study the Talmud, we're not studying because we want to know how to behave. If you want to know the laws of Shabbos, studying the Talmud won't teach you the laws. So now you have later books, the Code of Jewish Law, etc. Even today, you have later books that are even more contemporary, where you can learn, if you want to know exactly the practical observance of the Shabbos, open up, Art Scroll book or Shulchan Aruch, and you'll see exactly, because in Hebrew there's books. They'll give you all the laws of exactly how to keep Shabbos. Why do we study Talmud? Why do I every single Sunday I take time for an hour and a half? I study laws I'm in the middle of now, laws about sacrifices. This past Sunday, yesterday I was learning about a communal sin offering. If the community made a mistake about idolatry, they don't know if the Sanhedrin doesn't know they made the wrong ruling, the right ruling. It's not relevant for practical Jewish observance today. But the journey of Jews trying to wrap our mind around what it is that God wants us to know, that's the journey. And that's why the way the Talmud Bavli was written was not just in the way of rulings, the way the Talmud Bavli, the Talmud Yerushalmi. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, which is much shorter, was rulings, additional laws. Because we just explain, you have a Mishnah. Mishnah says a ruling. But what about in other cases that are not mentioned? What about in other scenarios? What about when something is slightly different? So there are many additional cases from that one case, many additional laws that are derived. So we add to that. But in the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, the whole journey, the path, the road was as important as the destination. Was part of the part of the journey that got recorded in the Talmud. Okay. Now, in addition, by the way, it's also why in the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, you have hundreds of pages of stories, so to say, of theology, of conversation. For example, the story I told you about Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Scared me, I guess. The story of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, right? It's a story. Why is it written in the text of the Talmud? Because that story teaches us something about how people should study and the way to study and about friendships and about, how people can get hurt in friendships. So that's a story that has a theological life lesson for us. And so the what we call Agadata, which are the stories, the theologies, the ethics, the memories, the history, they're not just like things that got left behind by mistake. When they were writing the Talmud, whoops, we have extra stuff, but we left it in there. All that is a part of the journey of how a Jew should internalize the wisdom of the Torah to know how they should behave. Okay. So that's also, by the way, why when we learn the Talmud as a group, it says that asking questions helps you understand better. So give us an example. Again, going back to the example of the wood burning. What sometimes makes a large piece of wood catch on fire? What makes a large piece of wood catch on fire? A small piece of wood. So a person can think I'm only a small piece of wood, but in the study of Talmud, a small piece of wood can actually enhance the large piece of wood. It's not a top-down approach. See, if it's just the wisdom being shared, I'm the wise one, I'm going to tell you the wisdom, top-down, I'm going to give to you. That's the traditional way in many other religions of how information is transmitted from the priest, from the rabbi, from the whatever, from the leader, giving it down. You have nothing to offer me. It's only a one-way relationship. I'm the teacher. I'm going to give to you. But in Judaism, in the whole way the Talmud is structured, where the students ask the teachers, and the question of the student against the teacher is recorded for prosperity. And when we open the Talmud, we can see how this student challenged his teacher, or this rabbi challenged that rabbi, and how this rabbi changed his opinion, and how there's revisions. Sometimes the Talmud is confusing because the Talmud will go back and forth. He first said this, then he said no, someone said that. He said, okay, I'll try this answer. Back and forth, we called it a shakla vitaria, back and forth, a dialogue, and the end will be the conclusion. He's disproven. To yufta, question indeed, this original premise of whichever rabbi, it's not correct. So why did you even bring it? If the whole premise is proven wrong, today if you're writing a book, would you write a book, a whole chapter, start off the chapter with the premise, then go disprove your premise, say, okay, I'm wrong. You would delete that chapter from your book. You wouldn't keep it there, right? But the Talmud keeps the premise that's going to be proven wrong, tells you why it's wrong, tells you how he tried to defend it and how it wasn't a good defense, tells you the other defense he tried and why that wasn't a good defense, how he thought maybe this could be a different case, but no, that can't because that's something else. So indeed, the premise is wrong. This is part of the journey to get to the truth, where a small piece of wood can actually enhance the larger piece of wood. And that's the whole beauty of Torah, and especially of the Talmud, that the way we learn is not that the student, the small piece of wood, is a part of the journey. Part of the journey, part of this, and that's what the Talmud preserves it that way, to give us a feeling to get there. Somebody's posting, imagine if the rabbis then had all the technology today. Yeah, but can you imagine what they were able to do without technology, just with the power of their brains? To sort, I talked about it last week, there's 63 volumes of Mishnah, 5,700 something Mishnah, as we said. To remember all that in your head and to know what you wrote, what you didn't write, to not repeat yourself, to understand the genius, to keep track, to mentally organize all of Judaism. Today, if I was going to write a book on all the laws, I would have folders on my computer, and every new idea, I put that into this folder and that into that folder. They didn't have that. It was all in their brains. Genius. Okay. So now, about 100 years or so after the Jerusalem Talmud is finished, the rabbis in Babylonia decide that it's time to compile a similar kind of Talmud in Babylonia, but this was going to be a much larger work, again, much more comprehensive with all of the discussion. It was primarily compiled by two colleagues called Ravina and Ravashi. And the word compiled is a very important word because they didn't write it. Who wrote the Talmud? What's the answer? Who wrote the Talmud? That's a trick question. No one wrote the Talmud. It was compiled from the teachings of literally hundreds of people. Say again? They're collecting their comments. There's many rabbis who all were contributed over the course of 200 years. You have to understand. Now, let's say there's a teaching of, for example, Rav, or a debate of Rav and Shmuel. You ready to hold your head for a second. So Rav and Shmuel have an argument. Now can come the next generation rabbis, and they can argue about what case were Rav and Shmuel arguing about. Were they arguing about if it was before the sword was in the water or afterwards? So there's two ways of understanding the arguments. Now you have four opinions because you have two opinions according to each rabbi how they interpret it. So and this goes further generations and further generations going down. So you literally have over the course of in the Talmud, you'll have a few hundred years worth of information quoting thousands of rabbis. Yes.
How did they know where to stop? How about the next generation and the one after them?
Excellent question.
So today.
So Michael's question is, how do they know when to stop? How do they know when to stop? Yes, excellent, very good question. So we'll get there in a minute. But I'll answer your question now. So basically, after Ravina and Ravashi compiled this, they made a break, like a generational break. And all of the rabbis throughout the world accepted the authority of this Talmud, which is why it became legally binding upon us. I'm going to explain this later. I'll say now. It's called Soif Hiro, the end of ruling, just like the Mishnah. The rabbis quoted in the Mishnah are called Amoraim. That's their title. So there's many rabbis. Rabbi Akiva, right? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Those are some of the names you remember. Rabbi Meir. All rabbis we're talking about. They are in the category called Amoraim. An Amora is a rabbi who lived in the times of the Mishnah, who has a certain authority. One Amora could disagree with another Amora. So Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai could all argue with each other. But later, once they finished the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda, after Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, now begins an era called Tanaim, a Tana. So Rav, Shmuel, Abaye, Rava, Rav Huna, Rav Chisda, Rav Kahana, they're all Tanas. So a Tana can argue with another Tana. Rav Huna can argue with Rav Kahana. But neither of them can argue with Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. You understand? Because they're from a different era, a different generation. So at the end, so you have the end of the Mishnah period, and now all the later rabbis, so Rav and Shmuel are earlier. Now we're debating the earlier teachers. So the next era, it's not one generation. The next era is like 500 years or so of an era of Tanas, and they are the ones that are the Talmud. And once the Talmud was finished, the Tanaim period finished. And now the next generation after that is no longer have the category of a Tana. They're called Gaonim. So you have Hai Gaon, you have Sadia Gaon. These are already the next era of rabbis in Jewish law. So they can't argue on a Tana. You understand? They're already a lower generation from a later point. So this is why today when we say a ruling of the Talmud is binding, even though who was the Talmud? It was rabbis. So why can't the rabbi today, Rabbi, I don't know, I don't say the names, I don't want to be saying, why can't Rabbi Denburg, say a different kind of rabbi. Why can't Rabbi Joe, Schmo, whatever, Rabbi Frederick, Mackenzie, I don't know, whatever, like, so whatever, why can't a rabbi today get a group of rabbis together? We'll disagree with the Talmud. The Talmud said you need to keep 2 days of the Chag. Talmud said you need to have mechitza, I don't know, whatever. But today, it's a different world today. We don't have that authority. Because once the Talmud came to a binding ruling, mechitza is not from the Talmud. I just give this a bad example. I don't get you distracted with that because that's from the times of the temple that separated the men and the women. We're saying once something is accepted by the rabbis of the Talmud, done. The next generation afterwards can only argue between each other. They can't go on the previous generation. But what I wanted to do, also bugging my, okay. So the bug wants to learn, huh? Yeah. Yeah, the bug wants to learn. What is the bug? After the Go'enim, you have Rishonim, which are, let's say, Rishonim after the Go'enim, you have the period of the Rishonim, which is, let's say, Rashi, Rambam, Tosfos. When we quote a Rashi, so Rashi is even after the Gaonim. Rashi is a Rishon, okay? So Rashi and the Rambam can have a disagreement. Just so you understand. You can hear a rabbi giving a class, and he'll tell you, so Rashi explains the Talmud or the Mishnah one way, and the Rambam explains the same Mishnah. The Rambam has a commentary on the Mishnah. He explains the Mishnah differently. So Rashi and the Rambam, or the Tosfos, or the Ritva, the Ran, whatever, they are Rishonim, so they can argue how to, Then you have the later generation is the Achronim, which are the last few hundred years of history. So the last few hundred years, they're already Achrons, so they can't argue. So today a rabbi can't say, I argue with Rashi. You can't argue with Rashi. You can argue with another rabbi of your era, but you can't argue with Rashi, yeah. Hillel and Shammai are in the Mishnah. They're the same time. Hillel and Shammai were colleagues. They lived in the same generation. They were the same time, and they're both Amoraim. They're both in the Mishnah. Okay. So now, let's talk. So I told you some stories of Yochanan. Now I tell you about this Rabbi Ashi. I'll tell you a really cool story about him as well. But I just want to make sure I went through all the differences. Number one, the Babylonian Talmud was made in Babylonia. Much more of the discussions. It was a much later time, which also means that the Babylonian Talmud today, if you ever have a disagreement between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, who do we give the ruling like? The Babylonian Talmud. That's correct. Even though the Jerusalem Talmud was written first, was written by quote-unquote holier rabbis in a holier place, but because there was less dialogue and participation, and the rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud knew what the rabbis of the early generation said, and they had a different tradition, they ruled and learned differently, that became the binding ruling, yeah?
So how do you know when to look at this one? When to look at
Generally speaking, look at the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud, generally speaking, someone says the Gemara gives a ruling, is the Babylonian Talmud. That's the primary Talmud that's studied, primarily is the Babylonian Talmud. Okay. Now, we have Abaya and Rava, who again are peer colleagues in the same generation. And after Abaya and Rava, we have these two rabbis, Ravina and Ravashi, who are the students of Abaya and Rava, who quote a lot in the Gemara. And by the way, they were children for Rabbi. Let's not get distracted with all that. We're running out of time. So what happens? They gathered all this together. Okay, so here's the story about Ravashi that I wanted to share with you. So Ravashi was a teacher, obviously, he was teaching all the information to the students. And he was very, very committed to the growth of the yeshiva. There were problems in the yeshiva. The building was not financially. The structure of the building was not good. And there was a yeshiva in a city called Matzah Mechasya that had gotten cracks in the wall and became dangerous to be there. It was considered like a dangerous building. So because it was dangerous, they demolished the building. No one could be in the building. So they didn't have where to live. So what did this Rav Ashi, the one who compiled the Talmud, what did he do? He moved his bed into this ruin, into this dilapidated building that was not safe. It was the ruin, destroyed, demolished. The building was falling apart. And he said, I'm going to live in here until they rebuild the building. And because the great rabbi was living in the building, living in this dilapidated room without drainage, without nothing, it was a ruin. Of course, everyone got together to raise the money and to get the work going. And sure enough, they rebuilt a beautiful building, a beautiful yeshiva, so all the students would have a place to go and learn. And says he didn't take his bed out of the construction site until the building was complete, including the drainage. Meaning, even after they put a roof back up and they put, okay, Rabbi, it's good enough, go home. But then you know what happens? A lot of construction projects, they get like 90% done, and then they get stuck in the end. He stayed till the end. He didn't go home until the building was finished. That's the kind of commitment he had to the study of Torah. And place about Abaya, by the way, is very, very poor. No, it's Hillel, it's whatever. Let me just tell you this story. A quick story, because you mentioned Hillel and Shammai. Hillel was actually from Babylonia. It's very, very poor. He came to study in Israel, and he came at that time. There was actually a fee to enter the yeshiva to go and learn. You had to pay the tuition, whatever the tuition was. I don't know, a couple, whatever the thing was. You paid. It wasn't like a year. Today you pay tuition for the year, right? Show up, don't show up. Then they paid every day to enter the yeshiva. He paid to go in. He didn't have any money, so he used to be used to go cut firewood and sell firewood, and then whatever he sold the firewood, we have money to pay to go to yeshiva and learn. One day he didn't have any money, and it was snowing very hard, and he couldn't cut any firewood. They wouldn't let him in. So what did he do? His desire to learn Torah was so strong, so intense, that he climbed up on top of the roof of the building and put his ear onto the skylight. Buildings back then didn't have electricity, right? Today, you want light, just put in lights and you have light. Back then, buildings didn't have lights, so they built skylights in the roofs so the light could go in. So it wasn't like a hurricane window skylight; it's a regular window. So he climbed up on the roof, and he was lying on the roof with his ear on the skylight so he could hear the learning of the Torah. In the meantime, it was snowing very, very hard outside, and the snow was falling and falling and falling on top of Hillel. But he was so engrossed in the learning, he didn't realize his body was freezing. As he's lying on the roof, and his body is lying, getting covered in snow. In the meantime, they're downstairs in the yeshiva and they're studying, and all of a sudden say, it's very dark in here. Why is it so dark? And they look up at the skylight. Does that look like a person on the sky? Something's blocking the skylight. So they send the guard, up to the roof to go investigate. He moves away the snow. He says, oh my gosh, there's a person unconscious on the roof. They bring him inside, they bring him to the fire, they warm his bone, they give him something, they warm him up. So what are you doing on the roof? He said, I couldn't afford the tuition. So I was listening from the roof. So for such a person, he gets free entrance to yeshiva for the rest of his life. He doesn't need to pay to come to learn. That was his level of commitment to the Torah. That was before we had like a Randy Grossman scholarship fund to make sure that we have a, yeah. Okay. Now the story I wanted to say to you. Good evening, Heidi. Yes, it's good to take a break for spiritual invigoration. So this Rav Ashi, who was such a dedicated learner, was teaching his students about the three kings about whom the Mishnah says that they lost their portion of the world to come. Three kings who were considered terrible, terrible sinners. Names were Yeravam, Achav, and King Menashe. Whatever. So he was teaching his students. The Mishnah lists these three kings. Sorry, Rav Ashi was giving a class, but sometimes you go in the class, you go long. He didn't finish, so he taught the first two kings, Yeravam and Achav. He didn't have time. The class ended, so he told the students, "Go home. Tomorrow you come back, and we'll discuss our colleagues, our friends, King Menashe." And he spoke about King Menashe in a very cavalier, not a respectful way. He was talking about a king, a Jewish king, but it was a Jewish king that had sinned, that had worshipped idols. So he spoke about him in a derogatory way. That night, he went to sleep, and King Menashe himself appeared to Rav Ashi in a dream. It's a story in the Talmud. Rav Ashi writes the story. Happened with him. And but you have to understand, part of what I was saying before, the story is not praising Rav Ashi. It's saying Rav Ashi made a mistake and he didn't see how he had to change what he said. But Rav Ashi records the story about his own mistake. That's the greatness of these scholars. They weren't looking to protect their honor, say, "Oh, I'm the greatest, I'm the smartest, I'm the best." They're very different. They were rabbis. They were rabbis who wanted to make the truth known. So he goes to sleep that night, and King Menashe appears to him in a dream. And Menashe challenges him and said, "You called us your friends, your colleagues, and the colleagues of your father. How dare you? How could you do that? How could you talk about a king in an disrespectful way?" So Rav Ashi then said to him, "What do you mean? You're a sinner. You worship idols, etc. And you weren't righteous. You didn't learn Torah." So King Menashe said to him, "I will challenge you. Ask me any. I know Torah. Let me ask you a question. I think you're a Torah scholar." King Menashe said to Rav Ashi, "Let me ask you a halacha question." And he asked him a question that stumped him about how you cut bread. I don't want to get distracted on the question. When you cut the bread with the hamotzi, when you cut the bread. And anyway, he asked him a question Rav Ashi didn't know the answer to. So King Menashe then gives Rav Ashi the answer. And he proves to Rav Ashi that he's actually, this king that was a sinner, was actually a greater Torah scholar than the great Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi is so he says to King Menashe, "I don't understand. If you're such a great Torah scholar, you know more Torah than me, how did you sin so badly and worship idols and do all the terrible sins that the Torah says that you did?" So King Menashe says to Rav Ashi that if you would have been living in my time with the temptation and the Yetzer Hara of idol worship, you would have lifted the hem of your robe to run after it faster than me. You would have lifted up your pants. You can't run so fast when the robe is down. You would have run even more than me. Basically, don't judge us. You didn't live in our time. You didn't understand the temptation. Every generation has their own unique Yetzer Hara. You have to understand in general. It's another whole Fabrengen. Every generation thinks we have the greatest challenge of all of human history. And anyone, look at all the challenges. We have the internet. We have phones. We have this. We have challenges, 100%. But guess what? Times of King Menashe, they also had their own spiritual challenge that they had to deal with, that they had to struggle with. And so your struggle is very hard for you. And the different generation had a different struggle. It was hard for them. Anyway, so the point is, King Menashe says to Rav Ashi that if you would have been there, you would have been even worse. Don't judge us. I missed one important point. When Rav Ashi didn't know the answer about the cutting the bread, he said to King Menashe, "Please teach it to me, and I will teach it in your name." I'll teach it in your name. Okay. So anyway, comes the next morning, and Menashe comes down. He comes to his class, and he said, "Niftach Let us begin by teaching about our teachers. He changed. Yesterday, he said, I'm going to tell you, tomorrow we'll learn about our colleagues. And today he started talking about King Menashe as my teacher. Because he taught me Allah. So this is an amazing story. Why is this an amazing story? Because this is the guy that compiled the Talmud. And here he's saying that yesterday he used the wrong language. He made a mistake by making fun of someone that the Torah tells us is a sinner. He was reprimanded and corrected. And not only did he accept the rebuke and change in the yeshiva, but he was preserved and wrote down in the Talmud for us living 2,000 years later, or 1,500 years later, to be able to say, oh, there was a story that Rav Ashi had a mistake and he didn't know the answer. He had to ask King Menashe for the answer. He wasn't trying to protect his ego or his honor. He wanted us to know the truth. One last story of this Rav Ashi. The Gemara Mayakotin says that when he was supposed to die, the angel of death came to this great Rav Ashi and asked him, told him it's time for you to die. Imagine before you die, the angel of death comes to you and tells you, sir, shalom aleichem, welcome. It's time for me to take you to the next world. So Rav Ashi asked the angel of death and says to him, do me a favor, give me 30 days. Why? Because I need to review all my studies. Because I want to make sure when I come to heaven, I want to come with my Talmud in my hand, my Torah in my hand, meaning fresh. So I'm asking you, don't kill me yet. I need time to review the Torah before I pass away. Understand? Understand what kind of holy person you're dealing with? This was a person whose whole life was study of Torah. A person who knew so much Torah, he was able to write and compile the Talmud. But he was the one that put it all together. It wasn't finished. It was finished by his son. He passed away. His son is the one that actually finished it like the finishing editing touches and sent it out to the whole world. But he was a main primary compiler of the Talmud. And yet, when it comes time for him to pass away, what is he worried about? I need to review my studies before I go to heaven to make sure I come to heaven and I'm fresh in my Torah knowledge. I know my Torah. Understand? It's a beautiful story. This, my friends, is the actual Akiva. No, it's Hillel. Akiva was not on the roof. Akiva was a shepherd. But Akiva was not the one on the roof. Okay, so this, my friends, is in short a little bit of appreciation of this era in history. Again, from a more like human angle of a period of rabbis for a few hundred years after the Mishnah, studying in a time of relative peace for the Jewish people, creating what would become the written Talmud. And what I want to really stress over here is that when they studied this, when they did this, and they came to a conclusion that all the rabbis agreed that this is going to be the end of the Talmud, the end of an era, that can't be changed afterwards. They were not like ending the conversation. Some people today might say they ended the conversation. We're saying the Talmud ends with us. They are the ones who made a future conversation possible. That wherever you would go in the world, you go to any Jewish community, you can go to a Sephardic community in Morocco, you can go to an Ashkenazi community in Germany, you can go to a Hasidic community in Poland, you can go to a Sephardic community in Israel. Wherever you go in the world, it's the same Talmud, not just the same Talmud, the same logic, the same rationale, the same premises, the same system of learning that became the primary way of ensuring that for the rest of Jewish history, we would have a way of being able to take the wisdom of the Mishnah and really of the Torah and be able to apply it into modern times. I heard a good example to explain this. This is the difference between closure and death. When you build a foundation, right, you bury the foundation in the earth, right? But what happens from that foundation? You build upon it. So it's buried in the dirt, but the foundation becomes, and you can build on it, and then you can build more on it. And depending on how strong the foundations are, you can build 2 stories and say, you know what? Let's build another. Let's make it a 3rd floor. And you can add and build on top of the foundation. Whereas death, that's closure. That's the end. That's the end of the story. So the closing of the Talmud was not a death. It wasn't like, okay, we're done, we're closing, we're burying it. They built what will become the foundation of all future Talmudic study and Jewish study throughout all the generations and all the places throughout the rest of Jewish history where Jews would study Torah, built on this foundation that these rabbis compiled, especially Ravina and Rav Ashi, to put together to have a unchangeable foundation upon which any Jew at the end of the generation could understand the foundations of the oral law of how Jewish law is decided today. Okay, that is the end of our discussion of the Talmud and the Mishnah. Bezrat Hashem next week, the beginning. Exactly, it's the beginning. This is the foundation to give you an appreciation to study Torah. God willing, next week will be Chai Elul, which is the birthday of the Baal Shem Tov and of the Alter Rebbe. It's a very, very special day. And so therefore, next week I'll talk about the foundation, how the Tanya came to be written. The same thing we just did with the Mishnah. And the Talmud, I'll tell you, in the Hasidic world, with the writing of the next foundational, transformational book, like the Talmud was foundational and transformational, Tanya was the same thing. And next week I'll explain to you why it is, how it is, and again, from a more of a human perspective, to appreciate that next transition in Jewish history. Yes. Pirkei Avot is one of the 63 volumes of the Mishnah. 62 volumes are the laws of the Sukkah, the laws of Pesach, the laws of marriage, the laws of divorce. And one volume is compiled of the same rabbis, but not technical legal teachings, but rather the moral, ethical teachings. But it's the same Mishnah, same category. That's much later. Shulchan Aruch is the Code of Jewish Law that's written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo, and then later by Moshe Isserlish. Can also be a class that was written 600 years ago, 700 years ago. Okay, so very interesting questions over here. Why am I seeing other students' pictures in front of the rabbi's screen? I don't know, Carmen. You're not seeing other students. You should be only seeing my screen. The story is a Hillel. I'm going from memory, Alice, but I'm pretty sure Akiva is not Akiva. Christianity was created by elite so people can worship idols. Okay, we're not going to talk about Christianity. I'm not an expert in Christianity. It's not my forte. The Talmud is discussions on the Torah, different rabbis' interpretation of it. That's correct, Marie. Yes. Talmud is not only the interpretation on the Torah, but interpretations of other earlier rabbis and how they interpret it. Okay. Heidi, your mother should be healthy and gesund, God willing. Good evening, Carmen. Shalom. Glad you're with us. Hello, Mr. Karaite Judaism. Now we won't discuss Karaite Judaism, but definitely not. Yes. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Okay. Good evening from Sydney. Hello, Luis. Greetings from Sydney, Australia. Okay. So thank you, Dan. Eugenio, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Eugenio Pena, asking a question. Isn't it forbidden to try to speak with the dead? Isn't that what Saul tried to do with Samuel? You are correct. It is forbidden. And it's forbidden. And I'm not sure the question. It's forbidden. What Saul did was wrong. It was not correct. He actually dies very shortly after this happened. If you know the whole story, it's that war when Saul dies, the war against the Plishtim. He's wounded by the Plishtim. Instead of allowing them to capture him and torture him and make a disgrace out of him in front of all the Jews, he falls on his sword and commits quasi-suicide. Shkoach Art, I'm glad you enjoyed. Zrat Hashem. Next week, same time, same place, God willing. God bless you all. Right? You agree, David? You agree. Okay. How are you doing? Good night, my friends. Good night, Heidi, Laila Tov, Mia Kel. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you, Carmen. Thank you, Corinne. I'm glad you're watching. All the way from beginning till the end. Look at that. Okay. Laila Tov, everyone. Toda Rabbi. Thank you, Shir. I appreciate the kind words. See you next week.